Welcome, everyone. Welcome to all of our wonderful panelists and to our host, Dr. Joshua Smith. So we are so excited. This is our third monthly panel from Dr. Joshua Speaks. We had one in July with pastors responding to racial unrest as Black male pastors. Our August panel was Black male teachers making a difference. If you haven't seen those two, they are on YouTube and they are amazing. And you should really look up Dr. Joshua Speaks on YouTube and enjoy those. This one is also being recorded and it will be live on YouTube after the panel, shortly after the panel, within 24 to 48 hours. So welcome everyone. The way this will work is Dr. Joshua will introduce all of the panelists. There will be Q&A from him to the panelists. They'll have a dialogue. And then the last 20 minutes or so, you'll be able to ask questions. So please feel free to put your questions in either the chat or the Q&A. Either way is fine. I'll be reading both of them. And I'll come back. I see somebody's already raised a hand. Good, you know how to do this. This is great. So we're not gonna take questions until the end, but if you do have a question for me, you can put it in the chat and I can answer it privately. So now I would like to welcome our wonderful host, Dr. Joshua Smith. He is an ordained minister. He's the lead pastor at Zoe Christian Fellowship of Whittier. He is a professor at Biola University. And he is the founder of the Solomon Center for Hope, which many of you will hear about in the near future. And of course, he is a social and legal justice advocate and public speaker. So hence the reason for these amazing panels. I know you all will enjoy it. And Dr. Joshua, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Connie, and welcome everyone. Welcome to our panel discussion today titled The George Floyd Legacy Through the Lens of Politics, Law, and Global Media. And since we put this together, how much our world has changed and made this discussion even more relevant than when we started putting it together. I'm thrilled to be, first of all, with friends of mine that I feel privileged to know. And I feel like I'm one of the wealthiest men in the world with respect to my friendships and people I know. And as I've said on all my panels at this point, this is proof that there's good in the world and why we should continue to have hope and why we should continue to fight for the good. I'm going to say a few things briefly about each of them here. I mean, they really go beyond their titles and accomplishments, but I'm just going to say a few things here. I know them all personally, and I'm just excited about what they have done and are doing. I'll start with Kelvin Driscoll. I've known him for a long time, since when we were both much younger. And Kelvin does many things. He's currently the program director for the LA County Department of Public Social Services. And he does amazing things there for our community, but that doesn't really sum up who he is completely. I mean, of course, he's a family man, but his heart and his passion is to serve. And he translates that into a commitment that is transformative. Of course, he's currently running for city council, and I know he's going to do wonderful things for his city in so many wonderful ways. So I'm just excited to have him here, and it's a pleasure to know him as a friend. He's also a brilliant man. So I love having conversations with him and just learning. So Kelvin, I'm a student of yours, definitely. And then, of course, Keisha Landrum Pierre, she is a CEO, which is amazing in and of itself, of a global media company, Sahara Reporters Media Group. But she's accomplished. She's another person I'm a student of. Just hearing her talk and just talk casually, you learn things from her. But she's a champion for justice, a champion for her industry. She is advancing her field. And she's on the cutting edge of media, and I'm excited to hear her insights today. I've known her since we were both very young, and she was amazing when I first met her, and she's amazing now. And then, of course, we have Lloyd Scott. He's a Renaissance man. There's so many things he's done. Of course, he's a retired police officer and has done wonderful things to serve our communities in that capacity. But he's also a minister. He's a scholar. He also has a heart to serve and to do good. And we have had several conversations. I'm also a student of his in terms of just all the conversations we've had and we've learned from. So without further ado, I've said some things about them, but then I'm also going to have them introduce themselves in terms of what makes them tick and what has compelled them to be on this panel. So I'll go in order that I introduce. I'll start with Kelvin.
I mean, wow. Following that introduction, I guess I'll just layer on top of that. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name's Kelvin, as Dr. Joshua mentioned. I live in Santa Clarita with my wife, Javane. We have a 3-year-old, Ava. She just turned 3 on the 21st. And Javane and I are both county employees, public servants. I'm now with my 5th county department. I like to say I wasn't fired from them. I've gotten opportunities to promote, and at the pinnacle of my career was deputy to Supervisor Janice Hahn. So I've had a great career here in the county of Los Angeles, and am now in the middle of a campaign for city council. Certainly unexpected in this political cycle, but I guess purposeful nonetheless. So I'm here because, you know, the feeling is mutual. I'm a huge fan of Dr. Joshua. I was trying to think about how old I was when we first met. I had to be somewhere around 13 or 14, and now I'm 35. So it just speaks to who you are and how instrumental you've been in my life. And so, you know, really simply put, I'll do anything for you. So thanks for inviting me to be here.
Thanks for being here. Thank you.
Wow, how do I follow that? Well, good afternoon to those of you who are in the afternoon time zone. Good evening to everyone who's tuning in from around the world. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here. As Dr. Joshua stated, I'm Keisha Landrum Pierre. I have the privilege of serving Sahara Reporters as the Chief Executive Officer. I've been with Sahara Reporters for 5 years, and the kind of work that we do is the kind of work that keeps me up at night, and it's the reason I'm still doing it. We break groundbreaking reports that impact Africans, African Americans in Africa and in the diaspora. The diaspora would be considered the United States, the UK, Canada, etc. I am on this panel because I have watched the role that storytelling and that media has played in capturing the story of George Floyd and others. I have watched what the media has done and has done well, and where there's opportunities for growth, and the important role that it can play for real change to occur. And so I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation today. And much like you shared, Kelvin, I also am a huge fan of yours, long before you were Dr. Joshua. And it has just been a pleasure to see your impact and your passion to make impact in the community. And so I'm really honored to be here and help advance the conversation forward.
Thank you.
Well, I'm honored to be here today, Dr. Josh. I remember when Dr. Josh was just Josh and played saxophone at church. In fact, I feel like I know all you guys. As a senior member of the panel in age, I've had conversations with parents, folks on the panels throughout the years. We've talked about the future, and it's a blessing to see the future manifest. I would go on and on, but it would get kind of sappy, and I don't want to do that. But I'm a huge fan of the entire panel, and I think that I know for a fact you guys are world changers, and it's just an honor to be a part of seeing that change happen in this way. For myself, I'm proud of every experience that I've had and been a part of, from high school basketball through being a police officer for 27 years, being a licensed minister and assistant pastor in New Life LA. And I don't know when you get to be a scholar unless maybe a scholar says you're a scholar, but I'm working on it. I love the Word of God. I see the answers for all problems in the Word of God, especially given my life experience and what the Lord has done for me. So whatever I can drag out of my life experience and insight and learning to share to kind of solve the problems that we're going to talk about today, I'm looking forward to it with great passion. And thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. And to all of you, thank you for being here. I'm excited. I want to get right into this. You know, we're all scholars here, all 4 of us. And I think maybe you feel the same way. I feel like the more I know, the more questions I have.
Mhm.
And I really am here to learn, because the world has gone in really some interesting places. And you are in fields that are informing this moment, law, politics, media. And so that's the first place I want to go. So, and any of you can jump in on this first question here in terms of going first or not. But my first question is, what changes have you seen in your specific fields due to the George Floyd tragedy? And I now have to add Jacob Blake as well. I think that has added another dimension of, I mean, because we first felt that the George Floyd, I don't think anyone thought it was final, but we were sort of like finally in the sense of people are seeing the urgency of the situation. And then we see the Jacob Blake dynamic happening, and there's dynamics going there. So tell me how your fields have been affected by this.
Would you like me to go first, Josh?
Sure, go ahead.
Well, I think my field has been very impacted if we're talking about the field of law enforcement. And that would be several books worth talking about. In brief, when I look at these situations, I don't see police work. I heard someone say a long time ago in a community meeting, it doesn't matter what uniform you wear. If you do wrong while wearing that uniform, you're wrong. And my training and experience says that there are better ways of arresting somebody besides shooting them or kneeling on their necks. And to what end, I'm still unaware. So my profession, that being law enforcement, is hugely impacted because that stain reflects on everybody who is a part of the profession. When I graduated from police academy, the chief of police said, once you're a police officer, you're always a police officer, because that's what people will know you and remember you by. So that stain is worn by everybody who wears a badge, at least in the public view. There's some answers that I think need to be implemented right away. But one of them is, I think that law enforcement has to work first to build trust in the people who it would serve. And how that works out is going to be unique to every community. But that transition and other things that I haven't thought about are going to be a part of the change that reflects how law enforcement has been impacted.
Yeah, with what you said, Lloyd, I want to pivot to Kelvin with respect to that. When you said differences in different communities, one of the things I've learned in some of my own discussions is how different policing is in different communities, different laws or what have you. And Kelvin, can you speak to that, and just also law and public policy in general, about how that's impacted things in your point of view with that?
Yeah, I think that's certainly an interesting nuance that shows up in Santa Clarita specifically. I'll start first kind of with your question, in that I think one of the benefits that we're seeing out of very tragic situations is that for the first time, it feels like constituents are paying attention to their local elected officials, right? Who has the authority to right what these wrongs are? And it's certainly one of the reasons that I was approached, I believe, to consider potentially running for office at the city council level. And so I think that is a good thing. And now people are starting to understand, who is your police chief, right? Like, was he elected or was he appointed? You know, if he was appointed, did the mayor appoint him? Was he appointed by your city council? Like, who made those decisions? You just start to see people digging deeper into that. And an informed constituency is always good. But I think it also means that there's a lot more accountability for local elected officials to kind of bridge that divide that Lloyd was talking about. But there are interesting dynamics that I think we're seeing exploited nationally that also take shape locally. So Santa Clarita, I like to say, is a purple city. You know, it's pretty evenly split among political lines when you're thinking about Republicans and Democrats. And so that means on its face, you could perceive, you know, the more conservative sides of the city really respecting kind of law enforcement and, you know, making sure that they're respected, whereas the more liberal side of that community is calling from everything from defunding the police on the you know, most liberal side of that spectrum, to thinking about how we reimagine policing on the more conservative side. But to Lloyd's point, and I think this is showing up in the political, if you will, as well, is just unless there's leadership that really guides what isn't a very emotional issue, you serve to continue to facilitate the breakdown in trust from residents and the law enforcement who's there to serve them, which I personally think will lead to a road of more fatalities. Because when you don't have either side trusting either side, then everyone's going to think about how they protect themselves. And I think there have been some recent events, even in Santa Clarita, where you see that demonstrated. But I certainly think to your question, the dynamics in our city could potentially facilitate a deeper divide if we don't think about where is the middle of, we all recognize that on some level, for cities to function efficiently and quote unquote normally, they have to have law enforcement. But does it mean that if you're pulled over, right, and even in some of the most recent examples for riding a bike, that it means that you die, right? Like, we have to think about where is that middle ground. And I think that there are times that our politics fuel that divide, but I've also seen examples where political leaders can bridge that divide.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So a couple things. So one, Lloyd, both you and Kelvin talked about trust issues. And then Kelvin, I like the term you mentioned, informed constituency. To me, that's a great segue into Keisha, not just to respond to the original question I asked, but we're in a dynamic of the whole notion of fake news is a thing. And yet we need the media. It's part of our constitutional right to have media, right? And they play a role, and I'm just curious what you have to say about how they've responded to it, and then your perspective as a journalist.
That's great. First, I think the comments so far have been interesting, and I've put a bunch of little asterisks. I want to talk about that, especially what you said, Kelvin, about an informed constituency is always better, because I think for the first time we're having a very real split in what informed is.
Yeah.
What information our citizens are being informed. And so what has been so incredibly difficult of being a leader in media, when you talk about leadership is so critical, leadership is critical in media, leadership is critical in the political sphere, and leadership is critical in all these various aspects where we're seeing a lot of breakdowns in leadership. And also we're finding that in the case of in the media ecosystem, where people are now accustomed to receiving their information, their news, not information, their news via an ideological filter. That's just normal. Mm-hmm. I am getting the news, what happened today, and your opinion with it. And instead of just finding out what happened, I've got to now try to sift through your opinion. And if I don't have the sort of literacy or skills to try to figure out what really happened, and then where your opinion, the line between your opinion and what actually happened, we've now created a difficult problem. Whereas in order to have a functioning democracy, you need an informed citizenry. But if the information is no longer objective, and if the information no longer has the integrity, how can we even build that and continue to have a democracy that thrives? So I think you brought up something that was really interesting. I put an asterisk next to it, because when we think about looking ahead, right, we have to think about the role that the media plays in stepping away from the sensationalizing, but recognizing the importance of amplifying what's important. And because we all have so much to gain and so much to lose, even as journalists, even as the media, there's also a role that media has to play in being professional and setting aside those finding that line between sort of setting aside those passions and allowing your audience, giving them the sort of dignity to decide what they want to decide based on the information that happened, rather than saying, hey, here's what happened and you need to believe this, you need to do this, etc. Because what we have found is that even if you do that with good intentions, that opens up the door for those with bad intentions to also do it, right? And we also talk about the difficulty with having an informed constituency, or informed citizens. You said informed constituency, but having informed citizens. The other challenge we're finding is that I think, Joshua, you and I talked about this, and I'd be interested in what the audience has to say. But before, you had institutions like the New York Times, or even an institution like Sahara Reporters, right? So we reach over 15 million people a month, right? But instead of only having these large institutions like the New York Times and the Washington Post and, I don't know, 60 Minutes, right? You also have, I don't know, Beyonce, who reaches 100 and something million people on her Instagram handle. Right? So you're also taking people who have a larger reach than these media organizations, putting out information and not having the journalistic skill to interrogate the information. And so what you guys are raising, especially what you, Lloyd, when you mentioned that there's a sort of responsibility to build trust. I think there's also responsibility on those who act as now like media institutions and the media institutions to play their role in building trust and having the discipline before putting out information to be objective, truly. And it's it is difficult, but it's absolutely critical if we are going to move the conversation forward and ensure that we have the informed citizenry or the informed constituency I guess what I say is to protect essentially the democracy that we do have.
Excellent.
I had something I want to say. Look, the last thing you said about informed citizenry, right? So I want to go back to the word citizen. I have some other questions in line, but your comments made me think about this. What is it? I'm curious at what it means to be a responsible citizen in all of this, because I feel torn as a viewer, as a citizen, when I how can I say, I remember like shortly after the George Floyd dynamic, and I remember seeing repetitive images of the police officer on George Floyd's neck, and just there's one particular news station that they just kept showing it over and over and over again. It just bothered me how they were showing it, but you know, we're all scholars. We ask questions. You know, when you go to college, they say, think critically, collect all the information, all those other kind of things. But we're in a dynamic where we're also pushed not to do that. We have to respond right now because of the urgency. And there are legitimate reasons to do that, right? Because if you let things sit and you let people who do unjust things feel comfortable, the same thing happens over and over again. So how do we balance the need to present something urgent? Like, I think the protests were necessary to communicate that urgency. We had needed to get people out on the streets and say, hey, this is not right. We don't want to wait for you to have another meeting and research and investigate. We want to do this now. And at the same time, as a citizen, as a critical thinker, I have to also pause and give myself an opportunity to look at everything. How do I balance that?
If this is a natural rotation, I'd love to jump in there.
Please.
One, a lot of thoughts came to mind as you spoke, Joshua. One is, how do we define who we is? We are very much a have and have not society.
Yeah.
And even in law enforcement, as I was trained, sees cops as one set, responsible or tasked with protecting everyone else. So there's an us and them in that dynamic. I think Keisha makes some really valid points about media responsibility, but I love the fact that things happen in real time and people see what's going on for themselves. There certainly needs to be a more professional editorial restatement or synopsis of what's been seen, but people need to know what's going on, because it's easy to have these conversations among scholarly people who have been to college and all that stuff. But in the real world, there are people who are not scholarly, who are driving the action. And if we don't know what's going on and we're not in touch with what's really happening, then we can have conversations that never touch or affect the stuff that's driving all of this. So we need to, I don't want to talk too long, Josh, but we need to really, I think, reassess who we are And I think people who are maybe consider themselves the haves need to take more responsibility, not from a government sense, but from a personal responsibility sense, to reach out to the have-nots and to include them. And so it needs to be important to me as a retired police officer that murder in a uniform never happens just because it's wrong. I shouldn't wait until I'm impacted or a friend of mine is impacted. I think there needs to be this kind of citizen heroic effort, to create a term, that must happen. Dr. King didn't have a job. Dr. King was a preacher. He had a church, he was a pastor. It doesn't appear that he really ever was at Ebenezer Baptist Church. He was always on the field doing stuff from a sense of social justice before that was a term. I think that has to happen in all of our disciplines before we begin to address the issues that we're trying to grapple with today.
What are your thoughts, Kelvin or Lakeisha, about the, how can I say, I don't know if balance is the word, but I guess whenever I see another incident, I have two impulses.
You're wrestling with this.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. Kelvin, do you want to take it?
Oh, go for it. I'll go after you.
Okay, sure. So I think there really is a tug, right? There's a tug between, do I respond right now or do I think critically? And if you, and to your point, if you have been trained in sort of critical thinking, you are sort of taught not to have a knee-jerk response, but to think it through. And that sort of knee-jerk response, even though it's raw and it's authentic, oftentimes because it isn't well thought through, it's missing certain things, right? But the other side to it, as you mentioned, is, well, if I think about this for 5 months, the rawness of the moment, the window of opportunity is shut. And it's just the reality. There is a moment when the entire world is looking at something, and then it's on to the next thing. And if you miss that window, understand the culture that we live in. If you miss that window, the window's gone, and you really do realistically have to wait for another one. And if you think about, and particularly in the media, we think of them as news cycles. So when that cycle's over, you sort of move on to the next thing. And so I think this idea of balance, we should just throw out of our head, because it's impossible to achieve. I think the idea that we can somehow balance these two, and they're not necessarily competing, but these two thoughts that are in tension, that are in conflict with each other, they won't balance. The reality, though, is there's a need for us to, and this is how I think about it from the perspective of media. There's the various kinds of media. There's the breaking news. And without the breaking news, people don't know that this thing happened. But then you have the deep reporting on the breaking news. You have the scholars who write the opinions on the breaking news. And all together, these sort of come together to put a picture that, standing alone, each thing could not have done. And I think we've realized that that those who respond right away, there are those who should, and there are those who do. But without those of us who are doing the critical thinking, the defund police immediate response, great. We're probably not going to defund the police, but man, if even starting that far over, when you do the critical thinking and come over, we do benefit from the folks saying that sort of more dramatic action, if you will, right? So I think the way that we can think about it is the role that all of these things play, and find where we fit within it. So from the perspective of as a scholar, we really say, okay, here's an injustice, we acknowledge it as such. There are those who, as you mentioned, Lloyd, do not have the scholarly, haven't spent all this time in college, etc. But quite frankly, they are more important to this movement than those of the folks who are sitting in the lighthouse. Okay, so we think about them; they are responding from this raw, visceral anger, which is critical to move these things along. And the role that the scholarly community plays is partnering and to do some of the thinking. That the mental exercise of thinking is truly an exercise, and it's a muscle that you build. And I think marrying those two, bringing those two together to work in some sort of lockstep, I think is how you help to move things forward.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, I mean, just to kind of add to some of that, I think really three things, right? I think when we think about the traditional kind of media apparati, if that's apparatus is plural, You know, I think the advent of the camera phone has completely changed the game. And I think that, you know, when we think about what social justice looks like in 2020, it is something as simple as turning on your phone when you recognize, something wrong. I do think though, and I think it's interesting that Lloyd brings up, Martin Luther King and some of our early civil rights leaders, because I think that they saw media as a function or a tool of the movement, right? Like, so how do we use the media in a way that helps us to facilitate some other end? I mean, when you think about, the marching on Edmund Pettus, and they knew that those things were going to happen, and they knew that they wanted cameras there to film it because they knew that once people saw it, it was kind of this shock of the conscience, like, oh my God, are people really doing that? And I think that still holds true today when you look at something like seeing a police officer pin this man down while life literally drains from him is a function of moving social justice along. I do think that there are very dangerous aspects of our media systems that sometimes serve to just facilitate people moving more to extremes and less, toward the center where we know conversation usually is most productive. But as I think about our work and I think about the fact that now we do live in a media cycle that is probably faster than it's ever been in the history of the industry, I think it just forces us to think about the same things that Martin Luther King was thinking about and the same things that those other civil rights leaders were thinking about. How do we use this as a function of an end, right? Like, how do we use this to help us achieve something? Because it is very different and it is tough. I mean, me literally trying to convene a community conversation about what was recently just reported in Santa Clarita is happening on the 6th for something that happened 2 or 3 weeks ago. And as you again try to engage that citizenry, it's like, well, we've had 3 other issues, at this point, like, you seem a little behind. So I think we're still trying to figure out how we work it. But, I see it as a function to be used to accomplish an end.
You know what, if I can comment, Kelvin, I couldn't agree more. And what I think is frustrating is that the thinking, instead of media as a tool, as a part of something larger, people behave as if they're beholden to it, right? Or at the sort of the way the movement of media like dictates everything else. And I think, and if there could be a shift in thinking, right, that rather than, okay, we talk about being responsible consumers, right, Joshua? Or Dr. Joshua. So we talk about being responsible consumers of media. Do I just wake up and allow all the notifications to pop on my phone? Or do I say, actually, no notifications when I wake up. I'll go into this app when I'm ready, right? Because we do have this sort of dynamic with media, not as a tool or not as a part of this larger ecosystem, but kind of running the show, right? Media these days, it really does feel like, okay, the news cycle is over, and we've actually seen some of that with what people will refer to as Black Twitter, pushing back and saying, no, this is important, and we're going to make this trend until you guys pick this up, right? So we have seen some pushback, but I do think you bring up an interesting and actually critical point about reimagining the role that media plays instead of it being such a dominant, sort of controlling, guiding force, but instead of it being a tool, as being put back in its proper place, I think.
Thank you for bringing it up. I like what you said about just our responsibilities as consumers of media. And I want to link that to what Kelvin said about, like, what are some ends that we can enact? And I want the 3 of you to speak to it from your professions, but also to think about what citizenry, viewers can do with that. Before I go into that, I just want to clarify something too. The question I asked initially with respect to the tug of war between critical thought and action, I want to make sure I'm not doing is suggesting that all the critical thought is with scholars and not with social activists and what have you on the ground. I think there's some incredible thought work.
Clarification.
In some ways, if you're not responding to this really clear violations of human dignity, you're not thinking, right? So there's that. And I just want to make sure that it's really the human, that really as human beings, what do we lean into in these moments? A critical, because not just that, there's a whole sort of due process of law dynamic that is involved that we are responsible to as Americans, that we need to make sure that process happens. And how do we, so how do we do that when the case is being judged already, and at the same time, you're going to want to have that sense of kind of like ethical judgment on this human injustice in the moment so people know. And there's also this due process of law that has to take place. So maybe this question just hijacked the question I was going to ask. I think, Kelvin, you were going to respond to that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think just another thread about that. And I think, I certainly had this conversation with my peers, is that some elements of it just paralyze certain people who don't even know how to have the conversation. I was, talking with someone, and when you think about how a Black man sees that video, right, as opposed to my white, friend, and we live in an age of such sensitivity, right? It's like, I see it. Yes, I saw it. I have my own personal thoughts about it, but am I in a safe space to share my reactions to it? And I think what you see a lot of, which may be experienced as kind of either this or that, is just people being afraid to kind of say, well, why was that a problem that he, was kneeling on his, neck? Whereas, other people see it and they go, that's clearly murder. I think there's an aspect of media in terms of what we're seeing in the context of like how we're just having conversations these days that is paralyzing for some people. It's just, they're scared to ask the question. They're scared to approach, a police officer or, someone of color to say, can you help me to kind of, help me to understand why people are reacting in this way? I've certainly, I personally had, white people come up to me to say, just kind of confidentially or secretly, like, can you tell me why, like, that was bad? And I think we have to give a little bit of grace for that, right? Like, we all come from our own experiences. And so for some people, they just don't have those experiences to really understand another's reaction. And I think we have to be better about creating safe spaces for those conversations, because I think it's in that vulnerability where you actually can kind of educate, which I know sounds condescending in a way, but there are lots of things that I'm ignorant to simply because I just don't know them, because I haven't had those experiences. And so I think that's certainly a space that we have to work from, in that grace of like, it's okay for you to be ignorant of why this is bad or why someone feels this way. And I know George Floyd is an extreme case, but I think we're seeing it in so much of conversations surrounding race that are happening now.
Josh, may I jump in?
Go, please, and I'll go after you.
I mean, it kind of goes back, at least in my thinking, to the point of defining who we are. Because, for instance, and Kelvin, I've been in that situation. In fact, I felt like a race apologist my entire career in law enforcement. I was always explaining things from the perspective of South Central Los Angeles, where I grew up, or some other experience. But this is an elementary school conversation if we just admit among ourselves, and I mean in the larger society, nobody wants a knee on your neck for 8 minutes plus until you die. Nobody enjoys that. And nobody sees that as necessary or even acceptable. So there really should not be. I know there is a necessity for it. I know I've been there. But once you reduce this conversation to how treat me the way, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, that basic, simple premise, then it all makes sense. So how do we speed up that enlightenment where we stop defining people by the darkness of their skin, the curl of their hair, or their education, or the car they drive, or the neighborhood they live in, and just have one justice for all? I don't mean to sound like I'm making up a sermon, but these things are basic until you try to synthesize them through the way we attempt to live life. and govern ourselves, which is grossly unfair to the majority of us.
I feel like both of your comments are reminding me of something that I'm reminded of as I engage cross-culturally, cross-racially as a professor. And I run into people who, I remember talking to a student who she had recently seen a kind of a historical slavery-based movie and came to my office and was just telling me how she was in tears when she saw the movie. And, I got, she hadn't been exposed to some of this stuff. But as I was asking her more questions, see, I at the time, I had thought she had some basic sense of history about this stuff. So I thought she was just responding to the emotional intensity. No, she just didn't know some facts.
Didn't know.
She didn't know slavery was harsh. And I was floored. I'm like, wait a minute. We have two different historical timelines. So if you don't have that history with all the nuances in it, there's no way you're going to interpret this George Floyd situation the way the average Black person, because you don't have any of the things that, and it was an epiphany for me because I just didn't think of it. I just thought they knew the facts. They just were like thinking a bit differently. No, they live in a different universe. We're in the same physical location, but they live in a different universe.
Which to me calls in that question of basic, right? Like, what is basic?
And that to me sounds like Keisha's camp, because she exposes through the media what's going on in real time to everybody. She can digest it, and then she can talk about it in intelligent historical context, which is needed. But it's that global approach to simple, basic truths. But no, I see a great potential. Like we said at the beginning, I see great potential in reaching solutions if we care to do it right now, not in the midst of the next, quote, tragedy, end quote.
Look, Keisha, can I ask you a question along how our conversation has kind of shifted here? So as just what we discussed right now, it takes me back to the historical tradition in African-American literature, for sure, of kind of double speak. So, the beginning of African-American literature was slave narratives. You have a Black writer who is communicating to an audience that is white and Black, but really they're talking to their white audience as well because they want to convince them to abolish slavery. And as a person in media, as a person of African descent in media, right? Like, is that a dynamic you deal with in terms of communicating to people in different universes? And maybe you could talk to like who you're perceived, like who you imagine your audience is and all those other kinds of things.
Okay, let me make sure I'm hearing your question or understanding what you're asking. So really just, do we have some version of doublespeak in how we communicate our stories? Yeah, so the answer is absolutely yes. I think what you're describing, Dr. Joshua, where you have a young, presumably white student who has this sort of intense reaction to the information, not knowing it happened the way it happened, all these things that she's finding out all at once. You'd be surprised that it's not actually just, young white children. If you've got an immigrant family that's come from anywhere, and whether it's in parts of Asia or parts of Africa, parts of South America, and they've immigrated here, and they see it, they also do not have the historical context. And unless that context is being given in an educational a school setting, when are they getting it? To your point, Lloyd, it really does come when it's the role of media to say, okay, here's what happened, but here's actually why it matters, to really providing that context. And that's why when I talked about the various sort of kinds of news, breaking news can't do that. This guy died at the hands of the police officer. Sure, but let's talk about why this really matters. And that's where the context pieces and the deep pieces come in. And so I think we actually do have a bigger challenge because unfortunately, Dr. Joshua, it turns out that there are a lot of people who do not have the contextual understanding of why this is such a problem and why it needs to be urgently addressed and how far it goes back and where the roots of this are coming from. So much of that is just missing from the conversation when you begin. So you'll have someone whose parents, you know, they're first generation arriving to the States or second generation, and they're watching this and they're like, this is terrible. And they're having these visceral reactions, but not fully understanding and getting that history. And so, you know, I think in some ways, Lloyd, what you mentioned is a heavy burden for media, right? Because we're also assuming that all the journalists get that contextual information. And I think one of the questions we do have to ask is, where are people supposed to be learning this? You know, is it in their educational institute? Where does that happen? Because there are a lot of conversations about how our educational system is not serving our citizens and constituents in the way in which it should be. And when we come to this moment, I think we do find that there's a lot of just basic information that a lot of people do not know.
Can I address that?
Please.
Josh? That's why I think as much as law enforcement may be, you know, we're in a real sense, we're the tip of the sword of society. Law enforcement does what it's told to do. Yeah. And how we get that communication, who it comes from, that's a whole other conversation, I'm sure. But law enforcement plays a big responsibility in the reason that we're here today. I don't deny that. But if we're somewhere at the cause of it, the media, I really believe, can be the solution, because media has multiple forms. One medium is a coloring book. When I was a child in the 60s, I was given this book called Color Me Brown. And I learned about people and things because of the media. Most of my education about my culture came from documentaries, not from books, because I wasn't that well read as a kid, but things that were attractive and interesting and compelling that I saw on television educated me and enlightened me and gave me a thirst to know more, which caused me to go to the books and start reading stuff that was dense and would otherwise have been uninteresting. So I think the potential and maybe even the responsibility for educating us, it doesn't happen in school for the most part. I think most people go to school to get A's to do what they want to do. The education comes when I want to know and I have a thirst for learning, and you all, Keisha, do that better than I think all of us. Or in another sense, we are all a part of you, because all of us try to communicate things.
Lloyd, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Follow up to what you just said, and this conversation about context and nuance. You know, I think what I think about a lot is, so the conflict between law enforcement and Black communities in America, that goes back since colonial America with slave codes and
1619.
Yeah, I mean, this is a long history, and I'm just curious. It seems like that knowing that police officers who know they're serving a constituency with which this has been the relationship for centuries, that there should be some education, at least to the history of it, even if you feel like now is different, fine. But to not know that and then come in with only a contemporary context, I'm just curious about, like, what's, as a retired police officer, what do you, just your knowledge of police culture and dynamics, like, what do you say about that?
Again, it's where I live, so I love talking about this stuff whenever it's a fruitful conversation. The people that think and talk and write are different than the people who do. And so a working police officer, I'll take myself, for example. As a working police officer, I had 3 kids, 1 wife, a house. I've got a basketball game to coach. I got 2 different basketball games to coach because kids are in different age groups. I've got a bunch of stuff. And, you know, when I was younger, I saw myself where I am now. So I'm spending a lot of time in church doing stuff because I really am trying to go to the next level in life. All that's happening. And I go to a radio call and I got to get stuff done, because as a police officer, you may go to 20 or 30 different radio calls in a night, and that's an average night, unless something major happens, like one of the situations we're talking about today, in which case everything locks down and then you're sucked into something else. All that stuff is going on as you are a part of an organization, which means you have to work well with the other members of the organization in order to accomplish public safety. That means that people are worried about getting their task done, because the task is not easy, getting their task done right now so that their peers don't reject them and they lose their jobs. That's where I think people live. Therefore, the leaders of these organizations have to be the broader thinkers. The leaders of these organizations have to give better instructions to police officers who work in the field. That is not to make an excuse for, again, a murderer in police uniform. I'm talking about general police practices, which are different than these awful, awful situations that bring us, to this conversation. And I don't know, I talked about a lot. I hope I answered your question, Dr. Josh.
No, that's very good. Kelvin, were you going to say something? I had a question specifically to you about. Let me ask you this question, Kelvin, and say what else you're going to say too. So, I have a lot of questions just on the level of police PR. Mm-hmm. Like let's just say they didn't want to change anything, but at the very basic level, you want to leave the impression with the group that you're working with that, like, you want to have a good PR situation, I suppose. And it seems like not even at that level, there's been no attempt to do that. I'll just briefly going to say this, Kelvin, then I'm going to have you answer. I've said it before in other panels where, when I was 17, senior in high school, I was delivering mail, some invitations to my graduation party, and the postal worker called the police on me, and I didn't even know. And then the police come in, point the gun at me, put me in the back of the police car. The one police officer goes in and talks to the postal worker. The other one is in the car with me, asking me questions and saying, "What set or gang am I from?" And I'm quiet. I'm handcuffed. I'm saying I go to Cerritos High School. I'm student body president, about to go to UCLA. He's harassing me and all these other kind of things. And it turned out, I obviously didn't die. They let me go. They paid for my mail and all that kind of stuff. Far cry from the things they should have done. But my point is, what a bad PR situation. This was 2 years after the LA riots, right? That was an opportunity to say, hey, we know how this looks. Let me say this, or at least I could come across telling a story about how those police officers took that situation and turned it into something else. But I'm just floored by those kinds of things. So I'm not just saying that to Lloyd, but to you, Kelvin, as well, in terms of public policy and city and what can we do in terms of just the PR factor with police officers?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. My answer is going to be a little long, so y'all, stay with me. Please. So this is not unlike what recently just happened, in Santa Clarita, right? You got two Black kids with a skateboard, ultimately have an AR-15, pulled out on them for a call that wasn't even about them. But I guess I go beyond the good-willed nature in the premise of the question, right? Like, we want people to see that we mean well and this was a mistake. I honestly think that when we think about how we will reimagine our police agencies or what policing will look like, I'm always skeptical of when the solution includes any kind of training. And I don't think that means it's a no. And I'm also always skeptical when, it's let's put this out to the community. Because at this point, I think that we are so beyond trust of anything that comes out of any law enforcement official's mouth that it's almost kind of, why would we even, say, because they're not going to believe it anyway. And again, it goes back to an earlier part of our conversation around, trust between law enforcement officials and the communities that they are protecting and serving is essential to the model, right? If the trust is not there, it doesn't work. But when I think about solutions, or when I think about what it might look like to reimagine the policing, I think about our fire department. LA County has its first Black fire chief in Darrell Osby. And, he talks about his journey in the fire service and how it is a very white, male-dominated, service because of the history, right? Like, little boys grow up seeing their dad be a firefighter, and then they, grow up and they want to become a firefighter too. And I think about when you know, for instance, have a gun pulled on you, or these other kids, you know, have guns pulled on them, or, you know, police are just too quick to use force, I can't help but think that that at some level comes from their experiences. And it's why I think it's so important that as we think about what the future of policing looks like, that is so critical that it looks like the community itself. Because I remember some of my earliest experiences with really understanding how big the world was came from college, right? It was when I moved away and my roommate was from New Delhi and I had another roommate from Beijing. And I'm saying this because it expanded my world, right? It made things less scary. And so I think we have to be intentional about training, yes, but I think you have a much more powerful intervention when you have maybe someone who is white partnered with someone who is of color, who has a certain experience, where they go, no, wait, like this kid, you know, like this is what this means. And I think we have to be more intentional about creating police forces that mirror the communities, because you learn from those experiences. Yes, training is important, but I think you learn from those experiences. And in some way, I think it just humanizes people, you know, in a way that would not otherwise happen in kind of a training context. So I think the short and direct answer is we're beyond ER, because I think that there's just such a breakdown of trust that it doesn't matter what they say. And, you know, now where we have much more litigation, like if what happened to you happened today, your parents would be suing whatever agency that was. And so you have this other added kind of aspect of litigation, which if you want to figure out the quickest way to, you know, decrease conversation, clamp down, is add a lawyer. People stop talking real fast. So I think, you know, that's the other part of it, is we're never even going to get there now with the context in which, you know, these events are being litigated today.
May I?
Please.
Okay, and I know you wanted to pivot to another part of the conversation. So Kelvin, I think perhaps because I spend so much time in media and see how powerful storytelling is, I don't know that I agree that we're necessarily beyond PR, but I'll share with you why. I have seen the power of storytelling shift perspectives that seemed unshiftable. And what I think you mean, Dr. Joshua, when you talk about PR, is telling the stories that are not being told to encourage more trust. Because in many ways, the way I see it is like, you just like what you said, Kelvin, that the trust isn't there. The question really is, so that's what PR is. PR is media. PR, you work with a media agency, they work with media publications to get stories out, right? And so the real question is, you think we're beyond it, but I actually think that if there was if anyone within the police those in leadership were thinking about this, and I've certainly had this question, Dr. Joshua, you know, I know there are some good guys in there. I know that because I have law enforcement in my family, so I know they're there. Is there no effort being put in to push the positive stories too? Because when you are being told stories, we have to remember that when a story is being told, oftentimes there's a little bit of an agenda behind it in the case of media. Especially when we're living in a world where media is told through an ideological filter, as I shared before. So if you're watching MSNBC, you're going to hear different stories than you'd hear on Fox News, right? Or different stories that you hear on CNN, or different stories that you'd hear in the Washington Post, versus different stories that you'd hear in a local news, you know, Orange County Register. They're telling different stories because they want to suggest a particular set of things. And I actually have wondered, because storytelling is so powerful, and because it's storytelling that's moving and guiding the narrative, I do find it interesting that we're not finding more positive stories being told, or those in leadership position partnering to tell the good stories, because ostensibly these law enforcement entities want to have better relationships with their community, and they are doing some positive things, but gosh, those stories are not the ones that are being told. And I think perhaps, Kelvin, we would walk away and say that it's beyond repair if those stories were being shared and people, and it wasn't working. But in my own estimation, what I'm seeing, I'm not even seeing those stories being told. I'm not even seeing an attempt at sharing the positive stories, which I know is a bit different from what you were saying, Dr. Joshua, which was, hey, here's a bad situation. Why aren't they at least having some PR to try to make it at least help, ameliorate the situation? But there's also just good stories that are not being told. And I wonder, and if more and more and more of those stories are being told, wouldn't that help some of the mistrust? I wonder.
I think it's both of what you said. In my situation, I mean, imagine if those officers seeing what happened, it's like, oh, this guy didn't do anything. Let me talk to her, and they would have been more gentle with it. And they didn't know I was going to have a national platform several years later. I mean, I'm telling their story every time. Like, this could have been a different story that I was telling if they had thought about, I need to think about how I interact with this young man. And maybe they didn't imagine me being in the place that I am right now. But I'm just saying, every time you have an interaction with a person of color in a law enforcement situation, it's a PR situation. And not that your safety or your protocol should be undermined by it, but I mean PR not in a manipulative sense, but in the sense of, let me talk about the good we do in this moment. And out of care, out of concern, let me alleviate your potential fears of police and what they intend for you. If that's truly, if people are gonna say most cops are good, right? To the extent that it's in your power in that moment, what can you do to reframe this moment for this young 17-year-old African-American boy? And so I think, Lakeisha, you're really speaking to it. But also, Kelvin, what you said with respect to, like, there is this kind of cynicism around training. there is in terms of how we hear that. I'm going to pivot here just a little bit because we did get a question that was sent to us in advance, and it speaks more to our global context. And Kelvin, you spoke to how our context is different today. It is. I mean, like, the world is watching us and engaged with us, so that adds another level. And so it speaks to what it means to be Black in the world, let alone in America. And so I have it's a rather lengthy question, but I think it's relevant to this. I'm going to read it here. This person who sent in advance compares. So I'm reading verbatim, okay? And this person says, I'd like to talk about how politics play into justice served versus justice delayed. And so what this person says is, in Minneapolis about 2 years ago, there was a case of an Australian woman named Justine Demond, who was shot by the Black officer Mohammed Noor when she approached his squad car after reporting an incident. The officer shot her, and sadly, Ms. Demond died. Then recently, in the same city, which we all know of, Minneapolis, George Floyd was killed so inhumanely, and sadly, justice looked very differently in the same city. And this is what they want us to look at, right? So justice for Justine Demond was this. With respect to Officer Mohammed, he was arrested. He was charged with murder. He had due process of the law and went to trial. He was sentenced for 12 and a half years in prison. And now the family is set for the first time to receive the largest payout of an officer-involved shooting of $20 million. This is what justice for George Floyd has looked at like so far. The officer was Derek Chauvin and others, right? Chauvin and others. They were not charged until the people got involved and continued to pressure the same politicians in Minneapolis who had just 2 years had delivered justice for the Justine family. They were finally arrested after the video went viral, okay? And now we're awaiting the trial. So that was a long setup, but this is this person's question. This is what they're saying. My question is, why is our justice delayed? And in a lot of these cases, often the victims do not get due process of the law unless it gets the attention of a march, protest, etc. Certainly we have to consider context. But I think you get the spirit of the question. So what are your thoughts about that?
I take that one, or was that
Go
for
for it.
Kelvin?
I'll let you, Lloyd.
I'm sorry, Kelvin. Well, there's a lot to unpack there. one of my fundamental problems is, if you go back historically, cops, especially in the South, were employed to catch runaway slaves. That was their function. Systemically, there have been practices instituted by governments to keep Black people in particular boxes throughout the South and the North. And the instrument to enforce those laws has been law enforcement. So the evolution of law enforcement is very slow, because as society changes and the double standards start growing closer and closer together, law enforcement makes adjustments. That's my personal observation. My problem is that will never be fast enough, because it's never going to be okay for a high school class president in the only neighborhood I believe he's ever lived in, I'm talking about you, Joshua, Dr. Joshua, to be treated like he's a gang member. But if you have police officers who are looking for the big bad gang member, then when they see a young African-American male doing stuff that looks different, they're going to project their what they're searching for onto that young man, and you get what we got in your experience. So there has to be a change that's a lot more than just PR. PR, it has become the megaphone that shouts, change has occurred. And so that don't sound too, in the clouds and theoretical. One change I would say has to occur is police officers, even though it's a part of their policy, have to start being made to ask the question, is pursuing this person worth what may happen once I get agitated and I press the envelope? I know we're going to have a fight. And if we have a fight, I know that I have the tools to dominate this fight. Mm-hmm. Is it worth going through all of that drama for what this person may or may not have done? I mean, and there are other kinds of things like that that would make life more fair for everybody that need to happen in law enforcement if we're going to speed up that arrival to that place of fair justice for everybody. I think governments are the legislatures and the executive the executive enforcers of the law, who are politicians. Like the president is the chief enforcer of the law for the country. So the executives and the legislative bodies have to create laws and policies that demand law enforcement treat everyone fairly, even if a low-level criminal gets away that time. And the next thing I want to tack on there is, we can't have government and or society that says, if a person's really bad, forget the law, just go get them. We can't have society and government saying, I don't care what you guys do out there, just get that bad guy because this one's really bad. And sometimes crimes are so egregious that we do just want to get the bad guy, forget the rules. We can't get to that level with law enforcement, because once you do that, cops then take that principle and they apply it to what they see. And so if in their mind, Malcolm Gladwell talks a lot about perceptions. If in their mind, 17-year-old kid looks like a Crip, then they treat that 17-year-old kid like, excuse me, a gang member. And then you get the injustice that we've gotten. So to make a long story a little bit shorter, yeah, laws have to change, pressure has to be taken off, and we have to give police officers the direction to do the things that we really want them to do now, not just a knee-jerk reaction to the next tragedy.
So go ahead, Kelvin. You gonna say something?
Sure. You sure?
Well, see, I was going to transition to, I want you to respond to the question, and I also want to get to some of the panelists' questions. So,
I'll be fast
as well. So, if maybe you can incorporate some of your response into the next panelist question, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. You want to take the question first?
Yeah. So I'm going to invite Connie. I'm going to invite you back to give us a sense of some of the questions that have been asked, and I'll let Kelvin take the first question, and then you can add to it with respect to the previous one.
Okay, the first question we received from James was, what about a federal law to set a standard for police conduct in every state? For example, George Floyd Justice Policing Act 2020.
Yeah, I think it actually fits perfectly into your question around the two instances that are seemingly the same in Minneapolis, and the role of policy in moving forward. What came to mind to me first is, we hear this a lot, the moral arc of the universe is long, right? But it bends toward justice. And I think what that's trying to tell us is, first of all, our justice system is imperfect, made up of imperfect people. And, to thread back to our earlier conversation about the role of an informed citizenry, I think that's the role the informed citizenry plays, because justice won't look the same in every instance that comes before a council or, the justice system. And there will be times where we get imperfect outcomes of that system. But, when you look at the arc overall, I choose to believe it bends toward justice, but I think it involves an informed citizenry that holds, elected officials accountable. And that might look one way in one case, and it might look, differently in another case. To James's question around policy, as a policy, future policy maker, as someone who works in policy, there are all kinds of policies on all kinds of books, in all kinds of jurisdictions. And I certainly think that it is part of the equation. But I think it's this question of, when we are trying to reimagine what policing will look like across our country, and keep in mind, and I think Lloyd brought this up, policing looks very differently when you look at the South versus the West Coast versus the East Coast and the Midwest. I think, certainly, should we kill people by kneeling on their neck? No, that might be universal across the country, and policy can speak to that. But I think we also have to be aware of the role that policy plays, and it is a tool in a toolbox. But I think a lot more of, when we're trying to realize what we want policing to look like, we have to think about the 17-year-old kid who's delivering mail, right? Or the kids on their skateboard. Like, how would we want our police officers to interact with those individuals? And as a policy maker, I know that policy has a role in that, but it is not the entire solution to that problem.
Thank you.
Yeah.
This question, I think, is to all of you. Christopher asks, what do we do next? What is our next move to begin correcting all of our choices?
It's an amazing question.
I guess I'll take it first. I think that you have to ask communities, who do you want to police your neighborhood? What do you want the police to do?
Yep.
And then those departments, even within departments, you have different neighborhoods. Departments have to be nimble enough to respond to smaller geographic areas and the needs of those constituencies. Police officers are paid a decent salary. Their bosses are paid decent salaries. You have to now demand that you don't just do your job traditionally or answer to your own objectives. You have to satisfy your customers. Mm-hmm. Now, sometimes that means asking your customers tough questions before the problem occurs, but you still have to have the foresight to ask those questions so that your outcomes and how you police communities looks like what people ask for. Mm-hmm. And in that way, you begin to build trust, because even the dialogue of figuring out what it is that folks want and how do we accomplish what you're asking us to accomplish, they get to know you, and vice versa. I believe in cops because I was a cop for 27 years, and I've seen some wonderful people. To answer Keisha's earlier question, people, when they see a police officer working with a little kid or helping somebody in distress, it's a nice story, but they're more excited with blood and guts. I think you guys say if it bleeds, it leads. Bleeds, it leads. So I think part of the problem with the perception and the good stories is that people really don't care about a nice cop. They want a cop that stops crime, but then they don't want crime to be stopped when it comes to them. Don't bother me with a small time crime. If I'm drinking a can of beer in my front yard, let me drink my can of beer on the front yard and leave me alone. But if it's somebody else doing it, yeah, I want you to hammer that person because they're a nuisance to our community. So individual communities have to decide what they want enforced strictly and what is not that big of a deal. So that would be a part of it. Let's be a little bit more nimble and let's satisfy our customers as best we can and let them be transparent enough to let them see that we're trying to give them what they want as opposed to forcing upon them what we want them to have.
That's insightful, very insightful.
Yeah, I love that response. I love the question to Christopher Smith. What do we do next? What is our next move to begin correcting all our choices? I love that question because it's a great question because the question is, what do we do next with the full understanding that we are participants in creating this outcome that we desire? And from the seat that I sit in, I believe it's becoming a responsible, first of all, understanding your responsibility, my responsibility, and our responsibility to be informed constituents. And being an informed constituent means that the comfortable information that you're taking in from whatever you've decided, whether it's, I don't know if it's CNN, I don't know if it's MSNBC, I don't know if it's cable news, I don't know if it's your local newspaper, but it's really to say, one, if I'm only getting my information from what I might call an echo chamber, a place where the information feels comfortable, might I consider also consuming information from a perspective I ordinarily wouldn't consider, right? Because part of this idea of understanding everyone's story means taking in stories from more than just one place. What do we do next? We take this notion of being an informed citizen into our own hands. So because I see how the story that my team picks is a story that will go viral and is a story that decides the conversation that trends on Twitter that day, right? Because I see how impactful we are, I'm very disciplined about what I'll take in. And I encourage all of you to say, okay, when I wake up in the morning, so for example, I have relatives who, they wake up in the morning, they pick up their phone, CNN has sent them their notifications, the New York Times has sent them their notifications, in some cases, Fox News has sent them their notifications, MSNBC, and everyone's telling them what to think, what are the things to focus on today before they've even gotten their day started, right? They've turned on their own decision on what the best source of news is, and they allow them to determine what the focus is for the day. I would say pause. Don't do that. Instead, start off your day with prayer and do not start your day off with the news that people decided to tell you what you should be focusing on. But start your day off that way and then decide, okay, I'm going to take in news from these 6 sources, and then from that determine my own understanding of what's going on and sources that are not the same. Because even if you do that very simple thing and decide that no, I'm not going to allow all the notifications to funnel and start my day or even at any point in the day, but I'll pause all the notifications and instead go after the news myself. That is a step. Just a step, but it's indeed a step in the right direction. I think as informed citizens, we have to discipline ourselves to also read the scholarly thinking on whatever the other side is for you. I think being open to perspectives that are not our own, because that is part of this what you describe so frequently, and I loved it, Kelvin, this middle ground. We're all running to our perspective extremes without embracing the perspective of another side. And to your point, Kelvin, that you also illustrated so beautifully today, to find a middle ground, we've got to be open to getting to that middle ground and hearing what the other side has to say. And so I think as informed citizens, let's take that back into our own hands, right? Before, someone would go and pick up the newspaper to now see what's going on. Now it's the news is being funneled. I would immediately stop that. So for anyone that I know and I love, I go into their phone, I say, no more news notifications all throughout the day from the time you wake up. That's unhealthy for your mental health, and it's completely distorting your own worldview. So that's what I would say from my seat, Christopher. Thanks so much for that question. I think it's a really important.
Josh, I'll layer on that. I know we're gonna get some of the other questions. I think it's a beautiful question because, and I always hate questions with a response that are another question, but I would say, Chris, what you can do next is think about what is it that you want. I think it's the same thing that Lloyd is saying. And I think one of the things that has been kind of threading through our conversation today is this idea of an informed citizenry, right? And so what do you imagine for your city? If you have children or you have family members, what do you imagine for their interactions where you live? And I would say, think about that in the context of community. I certainly remember as a kid knowing my neighbors, but I feel like that's a weird thing now. Like, people don't really talk to their neighbors, like they don't really know who they are. And so I think that there's some level of we have to get back to this idea of community. And we have to get, to this idea of, as a collective community, to Lloyd's point, what is it that we want? And then I think you become informed by, challenging yourself to watch, a city council meeting, figure out who, your mayor is, or, who your city council members are, or what they stand for. To Lakeisha's point, think about your local media, some of your smaller newspapers that will report on things specific, to your community. And then I think you find a way to get involved to promote a conversation about what you all want and desire for your community. I think that the question is really to you. What you do next is determine, what is your hope? What do you imagine for where you live and for kids in your community? And then you start the work toward that with those who have the power to make those changes.
Riveting answers. Riveting.
Another question here. What is the role of the faith community or church to help bring about a solution and being a platform for sharing the stories of others who are not normally heard?
Can I go first? I really love this question. Sorry. No, and I think, another kind of theme that has treaded through this conversation is about looking to the past, right? And looking, to kind of our civil rights leaders. I think that they were some of the most amazing organizers ever. And if you look at their strategy, there was one place that they went to execute that strategy. It was the church. They used the church to really push civil rights legislation and to really think about how we engage. And, so I certainly think that, and I think Dr. Josh talked about this a while ago, in a space, in a time where the legitimacy of the church is declining and it's becoming seen in a different way, especially when you insert kind of the generational divide in church. I think this is certainly a quote unquote opportunity to think about the place where the church stands in advancing, some of these issues of social justice. I think some of the brilliance of our early civil rights leaders is, they certainly found a way to not fall into the traps, kind of, if you will, of highly politicized conversations. And in my mind, I'm thinking about items like gay marriage or abortion, right? Those things were still going on, certainly not in the way that they're going on today. But I think some of the brilliance of those leaders were thinking about how the church, in the bedrock that it was in so many communities, was the ways in which action could be taken. And it was the ways in which, they were able to mobilize.
I'm going to piggyback, and I'm sure Lloyd's going to have a response to being bivocational like me. As a pastor, I'm going to piggyback on what you said, Kelvin. I think there's opportunity. And Dr. King is still an inspiration for a lot of reasons, I mean, a lot of people, they're looking for the next leader. And so they think of it as a speaker, like who's the next speaker? I mean, as you said, there's an organizational piece. And there are two longstanding Black institutions that I think aren't utilized enough. It's the Black church and it's HBCUs, in my view.
Yep.
I think there's incredible opportunity. The Black community is incredibly resourced on so many levels, and it gets camouflaged by the kind of the worst aspects of what we experience. But if we look at it objectively, there's all kinds of resourcefulness, not the least of which are the communities and the organizing we have. I mean, let's face it, especially in Black churches, people will talk to their pastor before they talk to their therapist or their doctor or their accountant. The relationships, you see people across generations, there's so much potential there. So I think we've been called out. I think the church has been called out. It's like, where are you? So we need to respond to that call. We need to gather ourselves and respond. And I think we can do it valiantly. I don't know if you want to say something about that, Lloyd, as well.
Yeah, it's funny. I loved reading about Frederick Douglass when I was a little kid. Frederick Douglass was his full title was Reverend Frederick Douglass.
Mm.
When you read Souls of Black Folks, the role of the church is huge in Du Bois's thinking. Or if you read Miseducation of the Negro, again, the church's influence as a viable profession, it was huge. It was up there with all the other professions, as it was in history. And of course, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and his staff of ministers, who were all preachers of the gospel, who saw an issue and spoke to injustice, is part of what is the Black church. So, and I could almost say foundational, except that I believe Jesus Christ is the foundation of the church, period. But Jesus is a God of justice. So to speak about Jesus and not be sprinting toward justice is hypocrisy, in my humble opinion. And that's true for everybody. And justice is truly blind. It's just truth is truth. The church, in order to regain its position, has to be righteous itself. I think over the last 20, 30 years, there's been a lot of failings that have happened under the guise of church. And there's been a lot of bureaucratic red tape and a lot of just mess that has nothing to do with the Bible, has nothing to do with Jesus, but it somehow still remained church. And intelligent people, especially, and now I'd be the least to speak on this, but I think especially younger people are like, I can sin on my own. I don't need to go to church to be around a bunch of people to tell me it's okay to do stupid stuff. I don't need that from church. The church has to be what it's supposed to be. It has to have integrity. And I think if it does that, then what Dr. Josh is doing is a perfect model of what the church should look like, where we are coming together, talking about serious issues, and we don't ever have to talk about church. Church is supposed to be the meeting place where righteousness occurs. And we just have to get back to that, whether we get a payday or not. I hope that no one saw what happened right before we started, but I was supposed to be in the sanctuary, an empty sanctuary, and that was supposed to be my background. A lot of stuff happened, and this got set up the way it is very quickly. My point is, a lot of people come to church, and so it's a natural place to gather people and to speak. It doesn't happen anywhere else where you get people to come to a location, and then they come, and then they pay their tithes and offerings and other gifts, but they pay to be there to be influenced, and then go out and do the things that they were influenced to do. It's a perfect machine if it's done right, in the right way. I don't know that, again, that we've lived up to that as church leaders, and we need to. And I think that will help the church to gain its influence and be the salt and the light in the world that it's supposed to be.
Thank you, Lloyd. And that'll be our last comment because of time. So I want to thank everyone for being on the call. I want to thank all the participants for being here. This has been a rich conversation. I've learned so much. Let's give our panelists a virtual hand here. And I just thank you for joining us. This has been a rich afternoon. God bless all of you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Dr. Josh.
Thank you.
And thank you, esteemed colleagues. I learned so much from you guys.
You too.
Thank you, everyone, for attending. We will see you first Tuesday in October. We're always first Tuesday, or almost always first Tuesday. So October 6th, noon Pacific. See you then.
Thank you. Bye.